with us. We're delighted to have you here with us. I am Bishop William Gregg, and I am an adjunct professor of systematic theology at the seminary. It's my privilege tonight to welcome you and to host this part one of Dr. Hill's time with us in this lecture series. And we are particularly delighted and pleased to have Dr. Hill with us. The Bishop Alfred E. White Endowed Heritage Lecture Series is an annual event in the life and work of Hood Theological Seminary. Okay, everyone should be on mute, please. The lectureship is in honor of Bishop Alfred E. White, who was quite a man and had a lively, vigorous ministry in a number of places, both academically and pastorally. He received numerous honorary doctorates in honor of his work. He served parishes in North Carolina, in Rockwell, in Gastonia, in Charlotte, and in Hartford, Connecticut. And he was in Hartford, Connecticut when he was elected presiding elder and then elected bishop in the AME Zion Church. His first episcopacy was in the 12th Episcopal District of the AME Zion Churches of 6 West African conferences. At the time of his death in 1992, he was presiding prelate of the 10th Episcopal AME Zion Church, which included conferences in Alabama, South Mississippi, and West Tennessee. He served in the community on numerous boards, covering a wide range of things from hospitals to YMCA to the Conservatory of Music in Hartford, Connecticut. So it's in honor of him that we carry on the tradition of ministry, of proclaiming the gospel, of sharpening our skills, broadening our knowledge. And in that context, we welcome the Reverend Dr. Johnny Hill, who is with us as the Leon W. Watts II Visiting Scholar in Black Theology at the Black Church here at Hood Seminary, and who is senior pastor of the historic Gethsemane Missionary Baptist Church. He also serves as director of corporate and foundation engagement at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Hill has had a distinguished academic career as Dean of Shaw University Divinity School and as a professor. He has authored several books, including Prophetic Rage, a Postcolonial Theology of Liberation in 2013, The First Black President, Barack Obama, Race, Politics, and the American Dream in 2009. He has demonstrated a premier capacity for leadership and fundraising in the academy. He was the founder and inaugural director of the Center for Racial and Social Justice at Shaw University. He also has served at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and as dean and scholar at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. He began his collegiate career at Morehouse College. He got his PhD in philosophical theology from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary at Northwestern University in Chicago. He is the founder of World House, a network of activists, faith leaders, policymakers, and freedom fighters, continuing in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of the beloved community. And he is the proud father of 2 children, Reagan and Jonathan. Dr. King, Dr. Hill, it is an honor and a pleasure to have you with us, and we are eagerly awaiting to hear what you have to say to us.
Very good. Good evening, everyone. I am incredibly honored to share with you this evening for the historic 2023 Bishop Alfred and Miss Mamie White Endowed Virtual Heritage Lecture Series. This is such an important and critical lecture series, and I'm so very honored to be with you this evening. I'd first like to say thank you, of course, to the president of this esteemed theological institution, President Virgil Lattimore. Thank you so very much, President Lattimore, for your hospitality and for your friendship and for the privilege of sharing this evening. I'd also like to say thank you, of course, to Board Chairman Bishop Darrell Starnes and Dean Eppenheimer as well, and to all of you as faculty, staff, students, and colleagues. I really, really appreciate this honor and the opportunity to share on this wonderful and historic evening. For the moments that we have together, I would like to extend to you an invitation to dream. And I'm going to pull up the slideshow at this time. Hopefully, we will all be able to see it. If you are able to see it, please just let me know if you're not able to see it. Okay. All right. So for the brief time we have together, I want to extend to you an invitation to dream. The focus of my presentation this evening is the courage to dream, focusing on Black life and sacred space. Black life and sacred space. I'd like to extend an invitation to dream, to have the courage to dream of a new reality, and to share in God's redemptive plan of a world that celebrates the gift of Black life, and of course, a world of freedom and human dignity for all. It is in this spirit, of course, that we celebrate, of course, the founder of Hood Theological Seminary, the late Bishop James Walker Hood, who had a vision of establishing a training school for young ministers, later leading to the establishment of Livingstone College, and of course, to Hood Theological Seminary as well. I'm grateful for the mission of this important theological institution that prepares women and men for bold and creative leadership for the Christian church and a diverse world. As we know, friends, we don't live in a vacuum. We live as part of individuals that are located in a certain history and understanding. So I want to first share with you the lens through which I come to this conversation this evening, just to give you a glimpse of my journey, both with theological institutions and a glimpse of my journey with faith as well. I'm so happy to now serve as visiting scholar at Hood Theological Seminary. And of course, my journey began at Morehouse College years ago, where I first became aware of the concept of human dignity as well. It was really in this space that the concept was first introduced to me in King's beloved community. It was further thickened as a theologian at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and then at the ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, as well. And then further, of course, developing my understanding of human dignity occurred at Claflin University, which is a Methodist-affiliated HBCU in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And then from there, I went on to Shaw University Divinity School, and of course, now at North Carolina Central University. HBCUs, as well as Black theological institutions, are incredibly important for the reshaping of a troubled world, particularly towards this vision of the beloved community and the world house. This is important because we do not exist in a historical vacuum. We are part of a long and troubled history of oppression, a history of struggle, resistance, and triumph as well. Hence, I would say the search for truth means understanding the role of theological education, but also the broader context of HBCUs as well. I want to point out a few key sort of facts and information about HBCUs as we begin the conversation tonight. Maybe you did or did not know that there are 101 accredited HBCUs, public and private, in 19 states, including the District of Columbia and U.S. Virgin Islands. Each year, these institutions enroll about 300,000 students a year. 80% are African-American students, and 70% often are from low-income families. They account for only 3% of public and not-for-profit institutions across the country that receive federal student aid. Only 10% of African-American students are enrolled nationwide, and of course, 17% of bachelor's degrees are earned by African-Americans at these institutions, 24% of STEM field graduates, and $14.8 billion in the economic impact of these institutions across the country. Okay. Right. So the historical context is very, very important to our conversation tonight. What does it mean, of course, to think about our historical context and recognizing that we didn't get to where we are, of course, in isolation? It was Frederick Douglass who reminded us that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. He said education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the human soul of man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which men can only be made free. Sojourner Truth reminded us that truth is powerful and it always prevails. So why is that important? Why is it important to sort of point out the historical context as we begin this conversation tonight? Why is it so critical to do that? I would argue that part of finding solutions and answers to the difficult questions that we face in today's world means understanding the connection between Black bodies and sacred space, Black bodies and sacred space. In a real sense, the world has been forever changed by the COVID-19 pandemic on the backdrop of the massive protests that occurred across the country in 2020 surrounding the deaths of individuals like Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and now, of course, the recent death of Tyre Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee. Of course, while racial killings are nothing new in America and around the world, the fact that these events amplified the reality of deep racial and social injustices and disparities have prompted new questions and spaces for reimagining our social, political, economic, and religious systems, even the church as well. It has perhaps opened the door for meaningful conversations about how we can do business differently, friends, and think in new creative ways about what we believe about the world and its relationship to the dignity of Black life. Of course, with the story of Tyre Nichols, what complicates this conversation is that it also involved 4 or 5 Black police officers as well. This shows that, of course, and I think this is very important, that the problem of race is never merely a Black and white issue, but points to certain ideas, theologies, and beliefs about Black bodies that have been internalized by both Blacks and whites alike. The legacy of enslavement and white supremacy has not just impacted whites, but also has impacted Blacks and people all around the world as well, in terms of how we interpret Black bodies and find meaning as well. Hence, we can focus for just a few moments, friends, on a few key themes: the challenge, the way in which Black bodies challenge evangelical Christianity, that it disrupts the narrative of white supremacy and offers a moment to confront nihilism and empire as well. So for a few moments, let us sort of reflect in relationship to these issues on Black bodies as sacred space, the stories of police shootings related to a number of individuals, Black pain and the historical struggle for human dignity, and the awakening that we're seeing all around the country now, awakening of the dignity of Black life, and Black life as the gift, as a gift to humanity. And then ultimately, how do we find the courage to dream as well? How do we find the courage to dream? Let me first begin by saying that Black bodies have always posed a great challenge to evangelical Christianity, centered in the emergence of white supremacy that aligned itself with the age of reason and enlightenment, where reason was often defined as what it meant to be human. It arrived as an exclusively Western white invention, alienating indigenous and so-called native African, Asian, and South American worlds. It was, of course, accompanied by Western cultural and hegemonic expansion across the world, bringing with it enslavement and colonization across the globe. Evangelical Christianity was an ally in those dark moments of human history in some ways, even as certain elements of evangelical Christianity showed redemptive features in its participation in liberationist struggles as well. One thing is for certain, friends, that is that Black bodies have disrupted the narrative of white supremacy in its relentless and persistent quest for human dignity. From the abolition of African enslavement to Martin Luther King Jr.'s prophetic cry to end the system of Jim Crow segregation in the American South, Black bodies have, by its mere desire to live, challenged the narrative of white supremacy, violence, and empire. In their refusal to give up, give in, or surrender to the dogs of dehumanization, Black bodies have issued a contestation with nihilism and empire. Nihilism meaning hopelessness, lovelessness, lifelessness, despair. That hope against hope that has defined the Black freedom struggle, and most recently the Black Lives Matter militancy, has become in some ways the antidote to the corrosive disease of nihilism and its companion imperialism and violence as well. So the presupposition that I'm operating out of tonight, friends, is the idea that the presence of God, the activity of God, is not limited to what we understand conceptually as the four walls of the church or as the traditional institutions that have come to define what we mean oftentimes by church. This idea is presupposing that the activity of God is present throughout the world, wherever there's justice, hope, freedom, human dignity, life, and the journey towards wholeness is where the activity of God rests and exists as well. So in some ways, understanding and taking seriously Black pain, Black bodies as a space for the inhabitants of the sacred, that God's presence is with Black bodies, that in the lives of people like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, that there the Holy Spirit and the presence of God is moving and operating and, of course, residing as well. What I want to argue tonight is that Black bodies, even though we are looking and trying hard to sort of interpret Black bodies beyond the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and white supremacy, that Black bodies are spaces of the sacred, that Black bodies represent and inhabit God's presence. And so what does it mean to view, to interpret Black bodies, bodies of young Black males and young Black females, or those that are in prisons all across this country and the world, as spaces of the sacred. In many ways, Black pain, marked by the struggle for human dignity through the crucible of enslavement to its present day forms of mass incarceration, poverty, and educational disparities, reveals the broader global call for human dignity. The Black struggle in many regards exposes the deeper challenge and struggle, of course, of other oppressed peoples around the world, including women, the LGBTQ community, and even systems of poverty around the world as well. So what I'd like to argue is that the problem of race becomes a doorway and a gateway for understanding the multitude of other challenges of human existence, or that race, how we interpret Black bodies, becomes a lens through which we might deepen our understanding of the struggles of other oppressed communities around the world as well. On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated, right there in Memphis, Tennessee, the same city that Tyree Nichols was killed, Dr. King delivered a speech at Riverside Church entitled "A Time to Break the Silence." There he talked about how the war in Vietnam was inextricably linked to the racial struggle in America. He admonished the silence and indifference of believers and people of goodwill, and urged people to have the courage to recognize, watch this, our interconnectedness and our interrelatedness. That we are, as Desmond Tutu observed, part of a delicate network of interdependence. So fighting for the dignity of Black bodies and humanizing Black pain uplifts all humanity, and in so doing seeks to dismantle the multi-layered systems of racism, violence, sexism, imperialism, and ecological injustices as well. So where does that leave us as we go on this journey of trying to understand what our role is as servant leaders, as people of faith, people of goodwill, as agents of justice in the world? What does it mean to seek and to engage in the quest for human dignity for today's time? Indeed, I am encouraged nonetheless, in spite of these challenges. I'm encouraged because I believe that there is an awakening happening among us now. That the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has demonstrated the persistent cries of young people for justice and human dignity. It has, in many ways, demonstrated that the diverse and populist movement, and let's remember that the Black Lives Matter movement is not just about Black students, Black young people. And I've been working on college campuses for nearly 2 decades now. What I've observed and feel very inspired by is that Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, is a very diverse and inclusive movement. It recognizes the importance of human dignity and human differences in fighting together for truth and justice, and of course, a better way of life. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has demonstrated the persistent cries of young people for justice and human dignity. It seems that the invention of social media has created alternative platforms for sharing and receiving information about new possibilities for bringing attention to the wrongdoings of individuals in local and global spaces. Of course, these new systems, of course, with social media, come with their own problems of political manipulation as well, and propaganda. And yet it also provides platforms to give rise and voice to the voiceless, and of course, others who may have been marginalized in years past. I want to conclude for just a moment by offering up the idea of Black life as gift to humanity. That Black life helps us to understand how to address the broader cultural problems of nihilism, hopelessness, meaninglessness, and despair. that without valorizing Black pain and suffering, it is redemptive in the sense that it helps us to think about how to overcome deep challenges facing the human condition and provide a vision and a space and a place to move forward. The resilience of Black faith, music, prophetic protest, and lament gives a voice to all who have been victimized or broken by oppressive systems. I am encouraged by the ability of people from all walks of life to work to make the world better and more just. From the abolitionist movement of African enslavement to the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation, and even the present efforts to reform police practices. It all stands as part of the prophetic witness of persons from all walks of life to work together, to fight together, to struggle together, to make the world a better place. Together, we can overcome and dream of a better world. Black life as gift to humanity is not just for Black people, but provides the discursive space to encounter the sacred and to see God's love and justice at work and the power of hope against hopelessness. So my question to each of you tonight, to myself as well, to all of us, is do we have the courage to dream? Do you have the courage to dream beyond the nightmare of injustice and suffering for all people? How do we begin to reimagine the practices of the church, the courage to move beyond the four walls of the church, to have an impact in the public square as well? I would like to conclude by inviting us, of course, to the activity of God in the world. Friends, we stand on the edge of a new global reality. We can be co-laborers with God in the healing and redemption of God's creation. Black bodies ultimately are sites of God's sacred and transformative work of love, compassion, truth, and human dignity. I leave you with this challenge. Let's make the world a better place. Let's make a difference together. Join me in the work and the activity of advancing the World House and the beloved community in the world. In his last book, in the last chapter, Dr. King observed these words: "We have inherited a large house, a great house, in which we should learn to live together, Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other together in peace." Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock on the second part of this lecture, I'll continue the conversation by talking about the World House. How do we build the World House together? Thank you, friends.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hill, very much for a thought-provoking and perhaps more importantly, just a provoking series of insights and interpretations and understandings for us to mull over and to consider carefully. We're going to have now a period of questions and answers, the conversation, which Dr. Hill referred to. And if you have questions that you would like for Dr. Hill to address, please put them in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring the chat box to make sure that we see all the questions, and I will convey them to Dr. Hill, and Dr. Hill, what you do with them after that is up to you.
Thank you.
Are there any questions from anybody? Let me just comment that I was interested, Dr. Hill, that, clearly you know the work and thinking of Desmond Tutu, who is certainly one of the great saints of my tradition, the Anglican tradition. And I was struck by the connection that you made between a constant theme in Bishop Tutu and the present challenge, that this is not about any particular individual or any particular group, but the dreaming and the bringing the dream to life is about us.
Mm-hmm.
That it's very much a corporate, broad, deep reality. Could you say more about that and how you see that working its way out concretely?
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for the observation, Bishop Greg, and the question. Desmond Tutu, I think, is such a revolutionary figure, because although he was rooted in the context of the Anglican Church, his gaze and his vision was much broader than just merely the Anglican Church. So he would introduce concepts like forgiveness and reconciliation, and of course, even salvation, and the liberating work of God in Christ in the world that has meaning in the public square as well. So the introduction of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was in part of his deep theological commitment to the atonement, to the redemptive work of God in Jesus Christ in the world, that God came to save the whole world. God is committed and interested in bringing the world back to God's self. As 2 Corinthians chapter 5 reminded us, that God has imparted to us the ministry of reconciliation. God has invited us into this journey of reconciling the world to God's self, both with each other and also with God. And as Desmond Tutu reminded us, part of that means, of course, seeking and pursuing justice, because justice is not charity. And this is one of the great points that Desmond Tutu often made. Justice is not charity. Charity is that which often brings attention to the giver. But justice is about reshaping and establishing systems that no longer call for the need for the work of justice. That justice ultimately, like restorative justice and other things like that, are meant to bring us further and closer, or into an approximation of God's justice and vision of the world. And so I think Desmond Tutu is still a very important figure, because in the American context, Bishop Greg, we really haven't had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was the John Hope Commission that was introduced by Bill Clinton in the late 1990s, but there really hasn't been a strong intentional effort to look at the problem of race in our country and how it's connected to other systems of oppression. How the LGBTQ community is treated, how the poor are treated, the challenges related to women and other communities around the country as well. So I think that Desmond Tutu and Martin Luther King Jr. as well help give us a language of understanding the connections between the church and the theologies that we have come to understand as part of the doctrine of the church, the doctrines of the church that has meaning in the public square as well.
Indeed. I was struck that, in a sense, as you're describing justice is what restores righteousness. That is, right relationship, not only with God and ourselves, but among ourselves, which then would bring new life for the dream of God for us and with us. So I appreciate that connection from you. I have at least 3 questions here. And another one popped up. As we navigate this season, how do we better understand or address what is the systematic racism that causes these Black cops to do this? I guess reference to Tyree Nichols' death.
Sure. That's a really great question. I think what complicates the story related to Tyree Nichols for many, and this is why I think you have a lot of civil rights leaders, human rights leaders that are a bit perplexed, is that it involved 5 Black police officers, and we're now learning that it could have involved even more police officers, but certainly those 5 that were directly involved in the beating incident involving Tyree Nichols. I believe that what this exposes is the persistent challenge of how we interpret, all of us, all of humanity interprets Black bodies as one of the troubling legacies of white supremacy and of course Jim Crow segregation and African enslavement that constructed a notion of Blackness and Black bodies as less than human. And so those ideas, Bishop Greg, were not just isolated to whites, but also Blacks internalized those ideas as well. So in this instance, of course, it involved a personal issue and so forth, but on a deeper level, it points to the problem of how we interpret Black life as sacred and how we understand the significance of Black bodies in the larger context of the human condition as well. So I'm very saddened by that incident that took place, of course, with Tyree Nichols. But I think it is an occasion to have a deep conversation, a conversation about the meaning of Black bodies, not just among predominantly white communities, but also in the African-American community as well, because the idea of Black on Black crime is nothing new. It's been around, of course, since the advent of African enslavement, and often there is a history of Blacks being used as agents of white supremacy and white systems of oppression as well. So I think that it's worth having a conversation about, but it just simply exposes the ideas and the concepts that often shape behaviors and practices in institutions as well.
Right, which leads to 3 difficult conversations, one within the Black community, one within the white community, and one between Black communities and white communities on the same topic. And that sort of the appropriation and internalized racism that we both operate out of is a tough nut to crack, but so important. Particularly in terms of the impact expressed in understanding the Black body and how important Black bodies are, both for Black persons and how white persons need to understand and appreciate the Black body as a gift of God. I liked that phrase you used earlier on about gift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Another question was, do you think we became too lax after the election of President Obama in assuming that racism was over? We have a Black president, all is well.
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very important observation. The fact that Barack Hussein Obama became president in 2008 is absolutely extraordinary. It was an incredible feat. And I believe that many of us, including myself, we were all very excited and very inspired by what took place. And it took a lot of effort and a lot of work, of course, to make that happen among activist communities and, of course, progressive political communities as well. But I believe that it did, Bishop Greg. I think it lulled us to sleep. I think that just like, of course, in post-apartheid South Africa, when many of the freedom fighters who worked very hard to end apartheid and were celebrating the inauguration of course, President Nelson Mandela, and then after the fact recognized that the systems that shaped apartheid didn't change very much. The economic systems, the political systems, and certainly the cultural systems that continued to run rampant were not necessarily impacted by the inauguration of President Nelson Mandela. The same is true for President Barack Obama. Although Obama became president, the structures in the system, the economic structures, as an example, in terms of the disparities in wealth in the country, didn't change very much at all with the presidency of Obama. The home ownership rates did not change very much. The educational rates did not change very much. The challenges impacting mass incarceration were not impacted very much. And it wouldn't be fair, I believe, Bishop Greg, to lay that burden just on a president, right, Barack Obama, since the president is, in fact, the face of empire. The president is the sort of public face of a larger imperial system, a larger system that seeks to maintain itself and grow in its own power. I believe that this is one of the other contributions that Desmond Tutu helped us to see, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. So we're invited to put on the whole armor of God. And I think that in this case, with President Obama's inauguration, it lulled many leaders to sleep. Many of us were discouraged to protest during Obama's presidency, and invited to just kind of sit back and let the leaders kind of work and navigate those different challenges behind the scenes. But I think what it showed is that the larger system of imperialism is certainly a very formidable force, and that won't be changed by symbolism. Even though symbols are important, President Obama becoming president was an important symbol, but the systems and the structures themselves were not changed very much. I like Peter Paris's comparison when he observed that in the biblical sense, in terms of the biblical context, Barack Obama would have been viewed as sort of the king. He would have been viewed as a king because he's a part of the political system. A Martin Luther King Jr. would be viewed as prophet. So I think part of the challenge is that many interpreted President Barack Obama as sort of in a prophetic role when he was really in a sort of political kingly role in a biblical sense.
Yeah, and he had to, I was often impressed that he frequently seemed to me to be the only adult in the room, which irritated the blazes out of the white establishment, which took a passive aggressive approach of just not doing anything, which is an ongoing challenge. What do you do in the face of passive aggressive resistance? You have any thoughts about that?
I think that's absolutely true. President Barack Obama understood, he was attentive to the burden of history that rested upon him. And when you read his autobiographical works and reflections after the presidency, it shows that he was acutely aware of his place and space in history, in American history. And so recognizing that understanding of his role in American history as it relates to race helped to sensitize him to the moment that he was in. So I think he understood that, but also his life is an example of how sometimes a person is shaped and prepared for certain roles. It wasn't just his academic training and experience that prepared him. It was also his sort of biological formation as a person of mixed heritage, and also his diversity of experiences growing up in Hawaii, in Indonesia, and of course in California in his younger years, that introduced him to the beauty of diversity and inclusion as he imagined his own role and place as an African-American man.
Thank you. Thank you. Question from the audience. Dr. Hill mentioned the church is not simply four walls. Can you speak more about the work of Black liberation at a time when some people are no longer attending church or are only attending church digitally and engaging in digital activism simply through posting memes or mentioning events on social media platforms?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Whoever raised that question, that's a brilliant question. I really, really appreciate that question. I was reading an article recently from The Guardian, and that talked about the changing landscape of the church and religion in America. This article actually was building off of the 2014 and 2019 studies from the Pew Center that talked about the radical decline of mainstream churches across the country. So individuals between 18 and about 32 are taking the position of sort of not wanting to affiliate with any kind of institutional religious tradition, but that still claim to be spiritual in some ways, but have a very deep suspicion of institutions, particularly religious institutions and the church. And so there is a rise in the sale of vacant churches because many of these churches are becoming or struggling for membership and to sustain themselves. Well, in terms of your question, Bishop Greg, I think what we're seeing is the rise of a new era, a new generation of individuals who believe that they can gain information and access to knowledge about the church, God, religion, faith through social media. The problem is this, that we don't have a problem of a lack of information. This generation has a problem of too much information and trying to navigate the sea of information that exists. The cultural problem that we face today is we don't have an anchor oftentimes to ground the access to knowledge that we currently have. And so social media, even the public square and coffee houses and lounges and other places become spaces where people are seeking knowledge and understanding based on, of course, all of the wealth of information that's available through social media. So I believe that what it says is this, that the future of both theological education and also the future of the church is perhaps, Bishop Greg, in the coffee house. Perhaps it's outside of the traditional walls of the church. And it means worshiping in new and different places and spaces, maybe worshiping outside at the park, maybe having Bible study at the local coffee house, maybe finding virtual spaces to encounter the sacred, to encounter God's presence as well. So I believe it's challenging our conceptual understandings of what it means to have an encounter with God and to understand our own space and place in this new and brave world.
Yeah, which requires imagination and dreaming.
Requires imagination and dreaming. I think I like what Walter Brueggemann said when he talked about prophetic imagination. He said prophetic imagination is what led the children of Israel out of Egypt and into, of course, through the wilderness and to Canaan land. Prophetic imagination is what gives rise to new ways of doing things and perhaps imagining how we can move closer towards justice and peace and dignity.
Indeed, indeed. Another question from the audience. If we are sincere about collectively building Dr. King's beloved community, how can we best pursue dismantling the social construct and myth of race itself?
Well, I think that's a really, really great question, because on the one hand, race is a social construction, right? It is an invention. It was introduced as part of the categorization and the compartmentalization of the modern world. So the age of reason and enlightenment introduced this notion of binary concepts or binary oppositions or compartmentalization as a way of understanding the world. And so categories related to race were introduced as part of that quest for understanding the world on the one hand, but also it led to systems of injustice and, of course, racism and colonialism, because it interpreted Blackness as negative, as bad, as not good, and in some instances as evil and wrong. And so that led to ways of thinking and ways of interpreting Black bodies that contributed to colonialism and enslavement and the like. Now, with that being said, the fact of the matter is that we're still battling those categories, and to remove those categories and to assume that now we're all Black, we're all just one human family, and that race no longer matters, or categories of race are not important, disavows us from the current and historical realities where we find ourselves located in a certain cultural, theological, and historical context that makes race an important category for understanding our human condition and where we are.
And it's certainly from the Enlightenment on, and the way you've described it here, with which I agree entirely, and then you bring to bear on the construct of race combined with the history of colors, specifically the history of Black and the history of white as colors and their symbolic values. And what that spills into in my reading is that valuing, respecting the dignity of the Black body as sacred space also hits and opens into the political, the social, the economic, and the sexual dimensions of bodiliness, and Black bodiliness in particular, and the struggle for the Black community over against the white community's interpretation historically of Black as sinister, evil, exotic, seductive, as if none of that applies to the white community that's never done any of those things, of course. So it becomes a very complex, multi-layered piece of work that we have to do in terms of deconstructing this really modern concept of race. It's only, what, 225 years old, maybe. And look at the power that it has had to shape all of us in not really good, healthy ways that reflect the gospel mandate to love one another, that reflect the gospel story of God's love for us that raises us into new life. I think that brings us back to the earlier point about it really does have to be about us. And seeing, I'm put in mind of a young woman in an interview that said, I don't want to hear about being racially blind. I don't see color anymore. If you don't see my Blackness, you're not seeing me. And how do we do that creatively and constructively as we bring to reality the dream that God loves all God's children without exception?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I believe Desmond Tutu put it this way, that we are part of the rainbow people of God. And by that, he meant that human differences should be celebrated and not tolerated. And part of, I think, the challenge that we have, even in the context of the church, is often we're as you observed earlier, we just kind of want to get beyond it. We just sort of want to get beyond talking about race or talking about other forms of differences, and just get about the business of enjoying each other as one community and one family. The challenge with that is that it is our differences It is our unique stories and heritage that makes us who we are. And in fact, I think it has some insight in the Trinity, right? In the differences, but yet the commonalities and the oneness of the triune God, the God that reveals God's self in 3 dimensions, God that is the God creation, God sustainer, a God maker of heaven and earth. And then there's also the God that reveals God's self as a first century Palestinian Jew. And then God the Spirit, God the Holy Spirit that heals, that renews, that reconciles, that brings back life, that restores. And so understanding our differences, I believe, is an awesome journey of understanding the beauty of God and God's creation as well.
Right. God, at least according to the scriptural revelation, does not have a sense of blandness.
Right.
Diversity, color, texture, sound, all of that is a part of the experience.
Well said. Absolutely well said. I think this is why this is a very exciting moment for us, for the witness of the church, and of course, for each of us who are concerned about questions of justice and reconciliation, is that by looking at the powerful nature of Black bodies as sacred, then we have an opportunity.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the exciting thing. And there were several questions about building beloved community and how we do that. And I think you just summarized rather well. What is it that we need to do in order to build the beloved community? At the core of which a number of people pointed out, of course, is the deconstruction, the dismantling of the concept and the practice of race and racism in order to move to that better place you were talking about, where God's beloved gather in all their great diversity and wonder and difference as the one people of God.
Yes, sir. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about tomorrow. So not to leave us with Bishop Greg, the struggle and the challenge, but where do we go from here? As Dr. King said, where do we go from here? And I believe building the world house through communities of justice and freedom and wholeness and reconciliation is a path forward. And we can talk about that, of course, tomorrow at 10 o'clock, but I'm super excited to continue the conversation as well.
Well, that's a perfect segue as we run up against our time here. And thank you so much for your insight and your presentation. There's a lot to think about. And as you have said, tomorrow we gather again to continue the conversation and move to that question with Dr. Hill of, okay, so what now? Where do we go and how do we get there? So, Dr. Hill, thank you very much for an hour here. And to all of you who joined us, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 10 o'clock.